The Shadow Ward doctor, Miriam Tate, arrived at the secluded Blackwood Asylum on a rainy October evening. The asylum, an ancient towering structure built of dark stone, was known for housing the most complex psychological cases. It was her first day as the lead psychiatrist for the infamous Shadow Ward, a place reserved for patients whose conditions defied medical explanation. "You're brave," the cab driver muttered as she stepped out. "Nobody lasts long in there." Miriam tightened her coat against the chilling wind and offered no reply. She didn't believe in superstitions. Her only interest was science and the truth. Inside, the asylum's director, Dr. Henry Calver, greeted her. He was a gaunt man with sunken eyes, the weight of years evident in his demeanor. "Dr. Tate," he said, shaking her hand with a weak grip. "Welcome to Blackwood. I hope you understand the peculiarities of your assignment." She raised an eyebrow. "I've read the files. Are you referring to the patient's claims about seeing shadows?" His lips tightened. "Claims?" "Yes. You'll see soon enough." Day 1. Miriam's first patient was Eleanor Farrow, a frail woman in her 50s who sat motionless in her chair, her eyes fixated on the corner of the room. Her records indicated she had been institutionalized after a breakdown, claiming to see living shadows. "Good morning, Eleanor," Miriam began. "I'm here to help you." Eleanor didn't look at her. Instead, she whispered, "It doesn't like you." Miriam leaned forward. "What doesn't like me?" "The shadow," Eleanor replied. "It's watching you right now." Miriam glanced at the corner. Nothing. Just a dimly lit wall. "You can't see it," Eleanor continued, her voice trembling. "Not yet. But it sees you. And it doesn't like you." Day 3. By her third day, Miriam had heard similar accounts from every patient in the Shadow Ward. All described a dark, shifting figure that seemed to follow them, whispering secrets and watching their every move. One patient, a young man named Daniel, grabbed her wrist during their session. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his eyes wild. "It'll attach to you too. It always does." Later that night, as she reviewed her notes in her quarters, she noticed something strange. The shadows cast by her desk lamp seemed to move unnaturally, stretching toward her like grasping fingers. She dismissed it as exhaustion and went to bed. Day 5. The hallucinations, if that's what they were, grew worse. Miriam started hearing whispers in her room at night, soft and indistinct, like someone murmuring just beyond the door. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror sometimes flickered, as though something stood behind her, though when she turned, the room was empty. Determined to remain rational, she began setting up cameras in her office. That evening, while reviewing the footage, she saw it. A shadow, tall and humanoid, standing in the corner during her session with Eleanor. It didn't move or flicker. It simply watched. Her hands trembled as she rewound the tape. The shadow wasn't there at the start of the session. It had appeared halfway through, as if it had stepped out of the wall. Day 7. The whispers turned into voices. "They know," a voice hissed as Miriam walked the dim corridors of the asylum. "You brought us here." She turned, but the hallway was empty. That night, Eleanor screamed so loudly that staff had to restrain her. When Miriam arrived, Eleanor was clawing at her arms, her nails leaving bloody trails. "I told you!" Eleanor shrieked, her voice raw. "It's here for you! You let it out!" "Let what out?" Miriam demanded. Eleanor's eyes rolled back. "It was locked away, but you called it. You don't even remember, do you?" Miriam backed away, horrified. Eleanor's voice changed, deepening into something inhuman. "You opened the door, Miriam." Day 10. Dr. Calver found Miriam in her office, staring at the cameras. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken. "They're not delusions," she said without looking at him. "The shadows are real." Calver sighed. "I warned you. Nobody stays long in the shadow ward." "But why? What are they?" He hesitated. "This place, it wasn't always an asylum. It was once a monastery. The monks here practiced dark rituals, trying to contain something. They called it the Watcher. It feeds on fear, attaching itself to the vulnerable." Miriam's stomach turned. "And you kept this from me? Would you have taken the job if you knew?" He replied quietly. "It doesn't just attach to the patients, Doctor Tate. It attaches to anyone who comes into contact with them." Day 14. Miriam decided to leave Blackwood, but it was too late. The shadow followed her everywhere, at the train station, in her apartment, even in her dreams. One night, as she sat in her dimly lit living room, the shadow finally spoke. You can't escape," it whispered, its voice like wind through dead leaves. "You brought me into the light. Now, I'll never leave." Miriam stared at the shadow, tears streaming down her face. "What do you want?" It didn't reply. Instead, it moved closer, engulfing her. The light bulb flickered and went out. Day 15. Miriam awoke on the floor of her apartment, the room bathed in a pale, unnatural light. She didn't remember falling asleep. The shadow had whispered to her for hours, his voice shifting between a low growl and a melodic hum, like a song from another world. When she stood, she realized the shadow had moved. It was no longer confined to the corners of her room. It was everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, even on her skin. "You can't hide," it said, its voice resonating from every direction. "You are mine now." Desperate, Miriam grabbed her phone and called Dr. Calver. He answered after several rings, his voice groggy. "It's happening," she said. "It's here. It won't leave me." Calver sighed deeply. "I told you, Miriam. You can't fight it. The Watcher, it becomes a part of you." "What do I do?" she whispered, tears streaking her face. "There's only one way to escape it," Calver said, his voice heavy. "But you won't like it." Day 16. Miriam began researching the monastery that had once stood where Blackwood Asylum now loomed. She found old documents and fragments of journals that spoke of rituals to bind the Watcher. The monks had apparently succeeded, trapping it in the stones of the building, but the ritual came at a cost: human sacrifice. One passage stood out: "The Watcher must be given a vessel. Only then will it return to slumber." Miriam's stomach churned. Was this what Calver had meant? She slammed the book shut. She couldn't kill someone, not even to save herself. Nimoid 18. The shadow became more aggressive. It didn't just whisper now. It screamed. It knocked over furniture, shattered mirrors, and left dark handprints on her walls. At night, it appeared in her dreams, showing her vivid, terrifying visions of herself as a shadow, wandering the earth forever. Her phone rang in the middle of the night. It was Calver. "You can't let it consume you," he said urgently. "Once it does, you'll be lost. You'll become like the others." "What others?" Miriam demanded. "The victims who vanish. They don't just disappear, Miriam. They become it, pieces of it, fuel for its power." Day 19. Determined not to become another victim, Miriam returned to Blackwood. The asylum was abandoned now, its halls eerily silent. She ventured into the shadow ward, carrying the ancient texts she had found. The ritual was complex, requiring symbols to be drawn in blood and chants spoken in a forgotten language. But it also required an offering, a living being to take her place. She couldn't do it, not to someone else. Day 20. The shadow grew stronger, its presence unbearable. It whispered to her, constantly tempting her, promising her freedom if she just let it take her. It showed her visions of peace, of her life before Blackwood. "Give in," it murmured. "It's easier. No more fear, no more pain." Miriam was on the verge of breaking. She hadn't slept in days. Her hands trembled as she lit the candles for the ritual in the shadow ward. The symbols were drawn, the chants memorized. All she needed was the sacrifice. "Take me," she whispered to the shadow. "Let them go. Let the others go." The shadow recoiled, as if surprised. "Brave," it said, its voice softer now, "but foolish." Day 21. The final day came. Miriam performed the ritual alone in the depths of the shadow ward, her voice steady, despite the fear clawing at her throat. She chanted the ancient words, and the shadow began to writhe, its form shifting wildly. The room grew colder, the lights flickering. As the ritual neared completion, Miriam felt a strange pull, like hands dragging her into the darkness. She screamed, fighting against it, but the shadow was too strong. "I told you," it whispered, its voice triumphant. "You can't escape me." But just as it consumed her, something changed. The shadows in the room began to glow faintly, and Miriam felt the pull ease. The symbols she had drawn burned brightly, and the shadow let out an ear-piercing shriek. The last thing she saw was its form collapsing into the floor, dissolving into nothingness. Epilogue. Miriam awoke in the hospital, her body weak but alive. Dr. Calver was there, his face grim. "You did it," he said softly. "You bound it again." "But it's not gone," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He nodded. "It never truly is." Miriam was discharged weeks later, but she was never the same. She avoided dark corners and never stayed out after sunset. Occasionally, she would hear faint whispers in the wind, reminders that the shadow was still there, waiting